Hi guys, the night air above the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had gone down. Far across the dark water, faint lanterns glowed beside small mud brick homes. The river moved slowly through the blackness, soft and steady, carrying reeds, drifting leaves, and tiny ripples beneath the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a fisherman pulled in his final net for the evening. The sound barely carried across the quiet water. Most people in ancient Egypt were already asleep. They slept on woven mats laid over packed earth floors. Some rested on simple wooden frames tied together with rope. Children slept close beside parents and grandparents beneath thin linen cloths. The heat still clung to the walls even at night. The dry desert wind drifted gently through narrow windows cut into mud brick homes. Tomorrow would be almost exactly the same as today. And the next day would feel much the same as tomorrow. For generation after generation, life in Egypt changed very slowly. A farmer born beside the Nile often lived much like his father. And his father had once lived much like the grandfather before him. The same river flooded. The same crops rose from the black soil. The same bread baked in clay ovens before sunrise. The same sandals pressed into dusty roads. Even the stars above Egypt looked familiar night after night. The people of Egypt did not expect life to change quickly. In many ways, they hoped it never would. Far before dawn, while the sky was still dark blue and heavy with fading stars, the first workers began to wake. A woman sat quietly beside a grinding stone. Her hands moved slowly in the dim light as she crushed grain into flour. The sound of stone against grain was low and steady. Nearby, someone stirred warm ashes inside a clay oven left from the night before. A rooster called somewhere beyond the walls. The smell of bread slowly filled the cool morning air. In another house nearby, a father tied worn leather straps around his sandals before stepping outside. The ground beneath his feet was cold for only a short while. Soon the heat would return again. He walked through narrow dirt paths between crowded homes. A donkey shifted quietly beside a wooden fence. Dogs slept beside doorways. A small oil lamp flickered behind a linen curtain. The village slowly awakened together. Egyptian life followed rhythms that almost everyone understood from childhood. The river rose. The river fell. Seeds were planted. Crops were gathered. Taxes were collected. Bread was baked. Nets were repaired. Stone was carried. Then the seasons returned once more. The Nile River decided nearly everything. Without the Nile, there would have been almost nothing except dry desert and endless heat. But every year, floodwaters spread across the land, leaving behind thick black soil rich enough for farming. This flooding happened so regularly that people trusted it deeply. The river became part of daily thought. Farmers watched its height carefully. Scribes recorded the flood levels. Families prayed quietly for healthy waters. Too little flooding brought fear of hunger. Too much flooding damaged homes and fields. Most years, the river arrived as expected. And because the river stayed dependable, much of life stayed dependable too. The same routines repeated across centuries. In the early light of morning, long lines of workers moved slowly toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. Their feet kicked dust into the air. Linen clothing hung loose in the rising heat. Some workers spoke softly. Others saved their energy for the long day ahead. The fields stretched green beside the riverbanks. Farmers bent low beneath the growing sun, pressing seeds into wet earth or cutting grain with curved blades. Children carried baskets. Older men guided oxen through heavy soil. Women brought water jars balanced carefully against their hips. The work was endless. And because the work never truly ended, Egyptian life became deeply tied to repetition. People understood what tomorrow would likely bring. The same roads would fill with traders. The same workshops would ring with hammering copper. The same smell of fish and baking bread would drip through village streets. The same officials would sit beneath shaded porches recording taxes onto sheets of papyrus. The same riverboats would glide through reeds under the burning afternoon sun. There was comfort inside the sameness. Ancient Egypt was not peaceful for everyone. Life was hard. Bodies grew tired early. Many people suffered from hunger, sickness, or injury. Teeth wore down from coarse bread filled with tiny grains of sand from stone grinding. Backs ached from carrying water and stone beneath heavy heat. But even hardship became familiar. People knew their place in the world. They understood the routines expected of them. Life moved like the Nile itself, slowly and steadily forward. Inside one crowded workshop near the river, a young potter sat cross-legged before a spinning clay wheel. Warm air drifted through the open doorway carrying dust and smoke from nearby ovens. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bowls, jars, cups, and oil lamps drying in rows. His father had once worked in the same room. And before that, his grandfather shaped clay there too. The same techniques passed quietly from hand to hand. A child learned by watching older workers every day. No written instructions were needed. The movements became part of the body itself. Fingers pressed clay gently. Water smoothed rough edges. Fire hardened finished pots inside brick ovens glowing orange through the night. Outside, donkeys carried loads through crowded streets. Merchants called softly from shaded stalls where onions, fish, dates, and woven cloth rested beneath hanging awnings. The smell of sweat, river mud, smoke, and bread mixed together beneath the heavy afternoon heat. Flies drifted lazily through the air. The sun climbed higher. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and continued slowly through the day. In Egypt, the climate itself encouraged sameness. Rain almost never interrupted daily routines. Seasons changed less dramatically than in many other lands. The sun rose predictably over dry earth year after year. Buildings changed slowly because the environment changed slowly. Mud brick homes remained cool enough to survive the heat. Flat roofs provided sleeping space during warm nights. Narrow streets created shade during midday. Villages grew gradually over generations without sudden redesigns. Many people rarely traveled far from where they were born. A farmer living beside the Nile might spend his entire life within a few miles of his village. The world beyond the riverbanks remained distant and uncertain. Desert stretched endlessly beyond the green farmland. Travel could be dangerous, expensive, and exhausting. So families stayed close together. Knowledge stayed local. Tradition stayed strong. A mother taught her daughter how to bake bread exactly as she had learned many years before. Linen was woven using familiar patterns. Fishing nets were tied the same careful way each season. Religious festivals followed ancient calendars older than memory itself. Even prayers remained steady across centuries. At sunset, people gathered quietly near shrines carrying small offerings of bread, beer, flowers, or incense. Priests moved slowly through temple halls lit by flickering torchlight. Stone columns rose high overhead, cool against the fading heat outside. The smell of oil smoke drifted through the dark chambers. Footsteps echoed softly against stone floors worn smooth by generations. The gods themselves represented stability and order. Many Egyptians believed the world depended on balance continuing without interruption. Floods must arrive properly. Crops must grow. Families must work. Temples must honor the gods correctly. Change could feel dangerous. Order brought safety. This belief touched nearly every part of life. Kings ruled for long periods. Officials copied older traditions carefully. Scribes preserved records with great attention. Builders reused familiar designs proven to last beneath the Egyptian sun. Even art stayed remarkably consistent. Painters showed people in similar poses century after century. Sculptors carved calm faces into stone using styles that barely shifted over long stretches of time. Temples honored old patterns instead of seeking entirely new ones. For ordinary people, this continuity made life feel connected to something ancient and lasting. A fisherman drifting across the Nile at dawn likely understood that his ancestors had done almost exactly the same thing hundreds of years earlier. The same narrow boat slid through reeds. The same birds circled above shallow water. The same wet nets dripped onto wooden floors. The same early mist rose quietly from the river before sunrise. Morning after morning, Egypt repeated itself gently. In a small riverside home, an elderly man rested beside the doorway during the hottest part of the afternoon. His breathing was slow. Nearby, grandchildren played quietly with carved wooden toys in the dust. A pot of lentils simmered over low firelight inside the house. Outside, the village shimmered beneath heavy heat. The old man remembered little difference between his childhood and the lives now growing around him. The same fields remained beyond the village walls. The same temple stood near the river. The same songs drifted from workers returning home at dusk. Time moved differently in Egypt. Not slower exactly, but steadier. The river created a cycle that made generations blend softly together. Even rulers understood the importance of continuity. Pharaohs often connected themselves closely to the kings before them. New rulers repaired old temples instead of destroying them. Names from the distant past remained respected for hundreds of years. Ancient traditions carried enormous weight. For workers, stability also meant survival. Changing farming methods carried risks. Changing irrigation systems could fail. Changing food storage practices might bring hunger. Families trusted what had worked before because failure could be deadly. So routines endured. At night, villages grew quiet early. Without bright artificial light, darkness settled deeply over Egypt after sunset. Families gathered close around oil lamps or small cooking fires. Shadows flickered across mud brick walls. Workers rubbed aching shoulders and dusty feet before sleep. Some evenings were filled with soft conversation. Other nights ended in near silence. The desert beyond the river cooled slowly beneath the moonlight. Dogs barked in distant streets. Crickets hummed beside irrigation canals. Water moved softly against riverbanks lined with reeds. And once again, tomorrow waited patiently beyond the darkness. In one home, a young scribe remained awake longer than most. He sat cross-legged near a low wooden table covered with scraps of papyrus. Beside him rested brushes made from cut reeds. A small lamp flickered beside jars of black and red ink. His work required long hours of careful copying. Records of grain. Lists of workers. Temple accounts. Letters between officials. Tax collections. The life of a scribe changed less physically than the lives of laborers, but it followed the same patterns day after day. His hand moved steadily across papyrus sheets while heat pressed against the walls outside. Scribes held respected positions because writing itself remained rare and valuable. Most Egyptians never learned to read. Knowledge passed mainly through spoken instruction and repeated daily habits. But scribes preserved memory in written form. They copied older texts again and again, protecting traditions from being lost. Even written language itself stayed remarkably stable over long periods. The symbols carved into temple walls connected generations together across centuries. A farmer could not read those signs, but he recognized their sacred meaning all the same. Near the royal cities, builders worked constantly beneath the sun. Stonecutters chipped limestone blocks from quarries. Laborers dragged heavy sledges across dusty ground. Foremen shouted slow instructions through the heat. Sweat darkened linen clothing almost immediately after sunrise. The work demanded patience more than speed. Massive structures rose gradually over many years. Temples expanded chamber by chamber. Walls stretched slowly across the land. Tombs disappeared beneath carved stone and painted halls. But even these enormous projects reflected continuity rather than sudden change. Builders used methods refined carefully over generations. Workers followed organized systems deeply rooted in tradition. Most laborers returned home exhausted each evening. Their muscles burned. Their hands cracked from rope and stone. Fine dust covered their skin. Yet the next morning, they returned again. Ancient Egypt depended upon repetition. Fields required constant care. Buildings required endless maintenance. Irrigation canals needed cleaning year after year. Grain storage demanded careful attention against insects, rot, and heat. Life remained stable partly because so much work went into keeping it stable. Along the Nile, boats drifted endlessly between villages carrying grain, pottery, stone, fish, papyrus, and people. River travel connected Egypt together like a long moving road of water. Boatmen understood the river almost instinctively. They knew where currents shifted. They knew when winds favored northbound sails. They knew which riverbanks flooded first during certain seasons. This knowledge came from experience repeated thousands of times. The river itself became a teacher. At dawn, mist floated low over the water while birds stepped carefully through shallow reeds searching for fish. Crocodiles rested motionless along muddy banks. Fishermen cast nets into silver reflections beneath pale morning light. By midday, sunlight blazed against the river surface so brightly that workers shaded their eyes with cloth wrapped around their heads. Then evening arrived slowly once more. Purple light spread across the water. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children carried water jars home through dusty paths. The sounds of labor softened into quiet conversation and distant animal calls. And Egypt settled gently into another familiar night. Inside homes across the river valley, ordinary families prepared evening meals much as their ancestors always had. Bread rested beside onions, beans, dates, and small portions of fish when available. Beer brewed from grain provided safer drinking than standing water in many places. Meals were simple, often repetitive, yet deeply tied to the land itself. Women spent long hours preparing grain each day. Grinding flour by hand demanded enormous effort. The motion repeated again and again until shoulders and wrists ached with exhaustion. Still, the work continued daily. A household depended on it. Children learned responsibilities early. Young boys followed fathers into fields, workshops, or fishing boats. Girls assisted mothers with cooking, weaving, carrying water, and caring for younger children. Life rarely offered long periods of leisure. But routines provided structure from childhood onward. People knew what was expected. That knowledge created a kind of quiet order beneath the hardships of life. In larger towns, narrow streets twisted between crowded homes and busy workshops. Goats wandered through open spaces searching for scraps. Donkeys brayed beneath heavy loads. Vendors rested beneath cloth awnings during the hottest hours of the afternoon. The smell of hot dust lingered everywhere. and always, the Nile remained nearby. Its presence shaped the rhythm of every settlement. Even the calendar itself followed the river's flooding cycle. The year divided naturally around planting, growing, and harvesting seasons. Religious festivals aligned with agricultural life. Taxes depended on crop success. Labor schedules shifted according to the river's behavior. For centuries upon centuries, this system endured. Not because Egyptians lacked intelligence or imagination, but because their world already functioned in ways that felt deeply connected, balanced, and reliable. A stable river supported stable traditions. Stable traditions supported stable kingdoms. And stable kingdoms allowed ordinary people to survive within a harsh environment bordered by endless desert. Late at night, after the fires dimmed low, silence settled heavily across the villages. The heat slowly faded from mudbrick walls. Workers stretched tired bodies across sleeping mats. Some listened quietly to insects beyond the windows. Others fell asleep almost immediately from exhaustion. The stars above Egypt remained bright and endless. Generations stared upward at those same stars while listening to the soft movement of river water nearby. And for long stretches of history, life beneath those stars changed only very slowly at all. Before sunrise, the air beside the Nile carried a brief coolness that never lasted long. For a little while, the world felt softer. The river reflected faint silver light beneath the fading stars, and the dark outlines of palm trees stood motionless against the horizon. Somewhere near the reeds, frogs croaked quietly in the shadows while birds slowly began to stir awake. In the villages, the first sounds of movement returned once more. A wooden door creaked open. Sandals brushed against packed earth. A sleepy child coughed softly beneath a linen blanket. An old woman bent beside a clay jar, pouring water into a shallow bowl before beginning another day that would feel much like the thousands of days before it. Egyptian life often began in darkness. Workers rose early because the sun quickly became too strong. By midday, the heat pressed heavily against the land, draining strength from both people and animals. So much of the hardest labor happened during the pale hours before morning fully arrived. Along narrow dirt paths beside the fields, farmers walked quietly carrying hoes across their shoulders. Their bodies moved slowly at first, not yet fully awake. Some chewed pieces of rough bread while walking. Others drank watered beer from clay cups before beginning the long hours ahead. The smell of wet earth drifted from the riverbanks. Far away in the distance, cattle groaned softly while being led toward grazing areas beside irrigation canals. Thin clouds of dust rose beneath their feet. Dogs followed behind the workers, pausing now and then to sniff along the roadside. Every movement felt familiar. The same roads had been walked for generations. The same fields had been divided and planted by fathers, sons, and grandfathers whose names were already forgotten. And yet their routines remained alive in the hands of the living. In ancient Egypt, memory lived less through stories and more through repetition. A child did not need long explanations about how life worked. Daily life itself became the lesson. The body learned first. Hands learned how to shape bread dough. Feet learned how to balance on narrow riverboats. Eyes learned how to watch flood waters carefully. Shoulders learned how to carry heavy baskets without spilling grain. Knowledge entered slowly through years of doing the same work again and again. This repetition made life feel stable even when it was difficult. In one small farming village near the western banks of the Nile, smoke already curled upward from cooking fires as the eastern sky turned pale gold. Women crouched beside grinding stones, their arms moving rhythmically back and forth through the morning quiet. The sound was soft but constant. Stone against grain. Stone against grain. It was one of the oldest sounds in Egypt. Nearby, a young boy carried water from a public well using clay jars suspended from a wooden pole balanced across his shoulders. The jars swayed gently as he walked. Water splashed lightly against the clay sides with each careful step. He had likely watched older children perform the same task for years before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became lean and strong through repetition rather than rest. Many workers developed aching backs before reaching old age. Knees stiffened. Hands roughened and cracked. The body carried the marks of labor year after year. Yet most people expected this. Hard physical work was not unusual or temporary. It was simply life. Even children understood exhaustion early. During harvest seasons, GHTLY against the clay sides with each careful step. GHT. Before finally become. GHTLY again. Before finally becoming. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became lean and strong through repetition rather than rest. Many workers developed aching backs before reaching old age. Knees stiffened. Hands roughened and cracked. The body carried the marks of labor year after year. Yet most people expected this. Hard physical work was not unusual or temporary. It was simply life. Even children understood exhaustion early. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together beneath the heat cutting grain with curved blades. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Straw scratched against bare arms and ankles. Workers bent low for hours while insects buzzed lazily around them. Then, after sunset, they carried heavy bundles home beneath fading orange light. Some evenings, the tiredness felt so deep that conversation itself became difficult. People simply sat together quietly. A small breeze moved through the doorway. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls. Outside, the village slowly darkened beneath the stars. And before long, sleep arrived heavily over exhausted bodies. This cycle repeated through countless generations. The sameness of Egyptian life came partly from the land itself. The Nile Valley formed a narrow green ribbon surrounded by desert. There were only so many ways to survive there. Farming schedules followed the flood seasons closely. Homes needed thick mud brick walls to resist the heat. Clothing remained light and simple because of the climate. Daily life adjusted to nature instead of trying to transform it. Even large cities reflected this pattern. In busy places like Thebes or Memphis, crowded neighborhoods stretched beside temples, workshops, and marketplaces. Yet ordinary life inside those cities still revolved around familiar routines. Merchants opened stalls early to avoid the midday sun. Scribes sat beneath shaded porches recording transactions onto papyrus. Laborers hauled stone, timber, copper, and grain through crowded streets. Bakers tended hot ovens before dawn. Fishmongers cleaned river catches beside buzzing flies. The scale of the city might grow larger, but the rhythm remained much the same. Near one marketplace, an elderly linen weaver worked slowly inside a shaded room open to the street. Long threads stretched across a wooden loom before her. Her fingers moved carefully, almost automatically, guiding the fibers into place. Outside, voices drifted softly through the afternoon heat. A donkey brayed nearby. Children laughed briefly before being called back to chores. The weaver barely looked up. She had performed this same work for most of her life. Her mother had once woven cloth beside her in the same room. And one day, perhaps, a daughter or granddaughter would continue after her. Egyptian trades often stayed within families for generations. Skills passed directly from older hands to younger ones. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. A fisherman's daughter learned the rhythms of river life early. A stoneworker trained children to recognize good limestone simply by touch. This continuity created strong traditions. It also limited sudden social change. Most people remained close to the class and profession into which they were born. Yet within this stability, families built meaningful lives. They celebrated births, marriages, harvests, and religious festivals together. They mourned deaths beside the same riverbanks where generations before them had also gathered in grief. The passage of time felt circular rather than sharply divided. The dead remained close through memory, ritual, and family land. Ancestors mattered deeply in Egypt. Many homes contained small spaces dedicated to family offerings. Bread or incense might be placed quietly before images of deceased relatives. People hoped the dead continued peacefully into the next world and might still offer protection or guidance to the living. This connection to the past strengthened the feeling that life should remain orderly and continuous. To break too sharply from tradition could feel disrespectful not only to society, but to generations already gone. Inside temple complexes, priests maintained sacred routines with extraordinary care. Before dawn, temple workers washed statues of the gods, replaced offerings, and burned incense within dark inner chambers lit only by torchlight. The rituals followed ancient instructions repeated precisely day after day. Clean water, fresh bread, spoken prayers, sacred oils, soft chanting echoing against cool stone walls. Many Egyptians believed these routines helped maintain balance in the universe itself. Order mattered. Predictability mattered. The rising of the sun each morning felt connected to proper ritual, proper farming, proper behavior, and proper rule. Even kings presented themselves not as destroyers of old systems but as protectors of them. Pharaohs repaired canals, maintained temples, and supervised grain storage because stability fed the kingdom. A reliable harvest meant fewer rebellions. Predictable taxes strengthened royal power. Stable villages allowed trade and labor to continue smoothly. And so the government itself encouraged continuity. Scribes copied old records carefully because ancient knowledge carried authority. Builders followed architectural traditions proven to survive. Priests preserved ceremonies passed down through centuries. The entire civilization leaned gently toward repetition. Not frozen completely. Small changes still occurred over time. Tools improved slowly. Trade introduced unfamiliar goods now and then. Different rulers influenced art or religion in subtle ways. But for ordinary workers beside the Nile, daily life remained strikingly recognizable across long stretches of history. A farmer from one century could likely understand the routines of a farmer living hundreds of years later. Both would wake before sunrise. Both would study the flood waters carefully. Both would labor beneath the same fierce sun. Both would return home exhausted beneath the evening sky. Along the riverbanks, fishermen prepared their boats during the quiet hours before dawn. Thin wooden vessels rested beside clusters of reeds where insects hovered over still water. Nets lay coiled neatly near baskets woven from river grasses. One fisherman rubbed sleep from his eyes while checking knots in the net by lantern light. His fingers moved confidently in the darkness. He knew every rope by feel alone. Nearby, his youngest son sat silently watching. The boy would eventually inherit not only the boat, but the knowledge surrounding it. Which stretches of water held the best fish during certain months? How to read changing currents. When storms might arrive from distant winds farther south along the Nile. This learning took years. And because it took years, tradition survived naturally through close daily contact between generations. Children remained deeply woven into adult life. They observed everything. Workshops, kitchens, fields, markets, and boats became classrooms without formal lessons. A child learned patience while untangling fishing line. Learned endurance while carrying water jars. Learned silence while sitting through long temple rituals beneath drifting incense smoke. Most children matured quickly because survival demanded usefulness early. Yet even amid hard work, moments of gentleness existed. At dusk, families sometimes gathered upon flat rooftops where cooler air moved through the darkness. Parents shared simple meals beside sleeping children while stars slowly brightened overhead. The desert night often felt surprisingly peaceful after the exhausting heat of day. The river carried soft sounds through the darkness. Oars dipped quietly into water. Frogs called from the reeds. Somewhere far away, musicians played faint drums and flutes during a wedding celebration drifting across the warm night air. An old man lay awake listening to these familiar sounds. Perhaps he remembered hearing nearly the same sounds decades earlier as a child beside the same river. That was part of Egypt's stillness. Life changed so slowly that memory and daily reality often blended together. The same songs survived. The same recipes survived. The same flood cycles returned. The same stars crossed the sky. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became lean and strong through repetition rather than rest. Many workers developed aching backs before reaching old age. Knees stiffened. Hands roughened and cracked. The body carried the marks of labor year after year. Yet most people expected this. Hard physical work was not unusual or temporary. It was simply life. Even children understood exhaustion early. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together beneath the heat cutting grain with curved blades. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Straw scratched against bare arms and ankles. Workers bent low for hours while insects buzzed lazily around them. Then, after sunset, they carried heavy bundles home beneath fading orange light. Some evenings, the tiredness felt so deep that conversation itself became difficult. People simply sat together quietly. A small breeze moved through the doorway. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud-brick walls. Outside, the village slowly darkened beneath the stars. And before long, sleep arrived heavily over exhausted bodies. This cycle repeated through countless generations. The sameness of Egyptian life came partly from the land itself. The Nile Valley formed a narrow green ribbon surrounded by desert. There were only so many ways to survive there. Farming schedules followed the flood seasons closely. Homes needed thick mud brick walls to resist the heat. Clothing remained light and simple because of the climate. Daily life adjusted to nature instead of trying to transform it. Even large cities reflected this pattern. In busy places like Thebes or Memphis, crowded neighborhoods stretched beside temples, workshops, and marketplaces. Yet ordinary life inside those cities still revolved around familiar routines. Merchants opened stalls early to avoid the midday sun. Scribes sat beneath shaded porches recording transactions onto papyrus. Laborers hauled stone, timber, copper, and grain through crowded streets. Bakers tended hot ovens before dawn. Fishmongers cleaned river catches beside buzzing flies. The scale of the city might grow larger, but the rhythm remained much the same. Near one marketplace, an elderly linen weaver worked slowly inside a shaded room open to the street. Long threads stretched across a wooden loom before her. Her fingers moved carefully, almost automatically, guiding the fibers into place. Outside, voices drifted softly through the afternoon heat. A donkey brayed nearby. Children laughed briefly before being called back to chores. The weaver barely looked up. She had performed this same work for most of her life. Her mother had once woven cloth beside her in the same room. And one day, perhaps, a daughter or granddaughter would continue after her. Egyptian trades often stayed within families for generations. Skills passed directly from older hands to younger ones. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. A fisherman's daughter learned the rhythms of river life early. A stoneworker trained children to recognize good limestone simply by touch. This continued before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village, before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became lean and strong through repetition rather than rest. Many workers developed aching backs before reaching old age. Knees stiffened. Hands roughened and cracked. The body carried the marks of labor year after year. Yet most people expected this. Hard physical work was not unusual or temporary. It was simply life. Even children understood exhaustion early. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together beneath the heat cutting grain with curved blades. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Straw scratched against bare arms and ankles. Workers bent low for hours while insects buzzed lazily around them. Then, after sunset, they carried heavy bundles home beneath fading orange light. Some evenings, the tiredness felt so deep that conversation itself became difficult. People simply sat together quietly. A small breeze moved through the doorway. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls. Outside, the village slowly darkened beneath the stars. And before long, sleep arrived heavily over exhausted bodies. This cycle repeated through countless generations. The sameness of Egyptian life came partly from the land itself. The Nile Valley formed a narrow green ribbon surrounded by desert. There were only so many ways to survive there. Farming schedules followed the flood seasons closely. Homes needed thick mud brick walls to resist the heat. Clothing remained light and simple because of the climate. Daily life adjusted to nature instead of trying to transform it. Even large cities reflected this pattern. In busy places like Thebes or Memphis, crowded neighborhoods stretched beside temples, workshops, and marketplaces. Yet ordinary life inside those cities still revolved around familiar routines. Merchants opened stalls early to avoid the midday sun. Scribes sat beneath shaded porches recording transactions onto papyrus. Laborers hauled stone, timber, copper, and grain through crowded streets. Bakers tended hot ovens before dawn. Fishmongers cleaned river catches beside buzzing flies. The scale of the city might grow larger, but the rhythm remained much the same. Near one marketplace, an elderly linen weaver worked slowly inside a shaded room open to the street. Long threads stretched across a wooden loom before her. Her fingers moved carefully, almost automatically, guiding the fibers into place. Outside, voices drifted softly through the afternoon heat. A donkey brayed nearby. Children laughed briefly before being called back to chores. The weaver barely looked up. She had performed this same work for most of her life. Her mother had once woven cloth beside her in the same room. And one day, perhaps, a daughter or granddaughter would continue after her. Egyptian trades often stayed within families for generations. Skills passed directly from older hands to younger ones. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. Before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on before finally becoming strong enough to do it himself. Now the work belonged to him. The village depended on thousands of such routines performed correctly every single day. Without them, everything could quickly fall apart. Bread would not bake. Fields would dry. Animals would weaken. Boats would stop moving. The order of Egyptian life rested on constant labor carried out almost automatically by ordinary people. As the sun rose higher, warmth spread quickly across the land. Workers in the fields tied cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves from the growing heat. Their feet pressed into damp black soil left fertile by the Nile floods. Birds circled overhead searching for insects disturbed by farming tools cutting into the earth. The river shimmered brightly nearby. Irrigation canals stretched across the farmland like thin veins carrying life outward from the Nile itself. Men used simple wooden lifting devices to move water from canals into dry fields. The motion repeated endlessly. Lift. Pour. Lift again. Hour after hour beneath the burning sky. Their muscles became lean and strong through repetition rather than rest. Many workers developed aching backs before reaching old age. Knees stiffened. hands roughened and cracked. The body carried the marks of labor year after year. Yet most people expected this. Hard physical work was not unusual or temporary. It was simply life. Even children understood exhaustion early. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together beneath the heat cutting grain with curved blades. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Straw scratched against bare arms and ankles. Workers bent low for hours while insects buzzed lazily around them. Then, after sunset, they carried heavy bundles home beneath fading orange light. Some evenings, the tiredness felt so deep that conversation itself became difficult. People simply sat together quietly. A small breeze moved through the doorway. Oil lamps flickered softly against mud brick walls. Outside, the village slowly darkened beneath the stars. And before long, sleep arrived heavily over exhausted bodies. This cycle repeated through countless generations. The sameness of Egyptian life came partly from the land itself. The Nile Valley formed a narrow green ribbon surrounded by desert. There were only so many ways to survive there. Farming schedules followed the flood seasons closely. Homes needed thick mud brick walls to resist the heat. Clothing remained light and simple because of the climate. Daily life adjusted to nature instead of trying to transform it. Even large cities reflected this pattern. In busy places like Thebes or Memphis, crowded neighborhoods stretched beside temples, workshops, and marketplaces. Yet ordinary life inside those cities still revolved around familiar routines. Merchants opened stalls early to avoid the midday sun. Scribes sat beneath shaded porches recording transactions onto papyrus. Laborers hauled stone, timber, copper, and grain through crowded streets. Bakers tended hot ovens before dawn. Fishmongers cleaned river catches beside buzzing flies. The scale of the city might grow larger, but the rhythm remained much the same. Near one marketplace, an elderly linen weaver worked slowly inside a shaded room open to the street. Long threads stretched across a wooden loom before her. Her fingers moved carefully, almost automatically, guiding the fibers into place. Outside, voices drifted softly through the afternoon heat. A donkey brayed nearby. Children laughed briefly before being called back to chores. The weaver barely looked up. She had performed this same work for most of her life. Her mother had once woven cloth beside her in the same room. And one day, perhaps, a daughter or granddaughter would continue after her. Egyptian trades often stayed within families for generations. Skills passed directly from older hands to younger ones. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. A fisherman's daughter learned the rhythms of river life early. A stoneworker trained children to recognize good limestone simply by touch. This continuity created strong traditions. It also limited sudden social change. Most people remained close to the class and profession into which they were born. Yet within this stability, families built meaningful lives. They celebrated births, marriages, harvests, and religious festivals together. They mourned deaths beside the same riverbanks where generations before them had also gathered in grief. The passage of time felt circular rather than sharply divided. The dead remained close through memory, ritual, and family land. Ancestors mattered deeply in Egypt. Many homes contained small spaces dedicated to family offerings. Bread or incense might be placed quietly before images of deceased relatives. People hoped the dead continued peacefully into the next world and might still offer protection or guidance to the living. This connection to the past strengthened the feeling that life should remain orderly and continuous. To break too sharply from tradition could feel disrespectful not only to society, but to generations already gone. Inside temple complexes, priests maintained sacred routines with extraordinary care. Before dawn, temple workers washed statues of the gods, replaced offerings, and burned incense within dark inner chambers lit only by torchlight. The rituals followed ancient instructions repeated precisely day after day. Clean water, fresh bread, spoken prayers, sacred oils, soft chanting echoing against cool stone walls. Many Egyptians believed these routines helped maintain balance in the universe itself. Order mattered. Predictability mattered. The rising of the sun each morning felt connected to proper ritual, proper farming, proper behavior, and proper rule. Even kings presented themselves not as destroyers of old systems but as protectors of them. Pharaohs repaired canals, maintained temples, and supervised grain storage because stability fed the kingdom. A reliable harvest meant fewer rebellions. Predictable taxes strengthened royal power. Stable villages allowed trade and labor to continue smoothly. And so the government itself encouraged continuity. Scribes copied old records carefully because ancient knowledge carried authority. Builders followed architectural traditions proven to survive. Priests preserved ceremonies passed down through centuries. The entire civilization leaned gently toward repetition. Not frozen completely. Small changes still occurred over time. Tools improved slowly. Trade introduced unfamiliar goods now and then. Different rulers influenced art or religion in subtle ways. But for ordinary workers beside the Nile, daily life remained strikingly recognizable across long stretches of history. A farmer from one century could likely understand the routines of a farmer living hundreds of years later. Both would wake before sunrise. Both would study the flood waters carefully. Both would labor beneath the same fierce sun. Okayed up. She had performed this same work for most of her life. Her mother had once woven cloth beside her in the same room. And one day, perhaps, a daughter or granddaughter would continue after her. Egyptian trades often stayed within families for generations. Skills passed directly from older hands to younger ones. A carpenter's son might become a carpenter. A fisherman's daughter learned the rhythms of river life early. A stoneworker trained children to recognize good limestone simply by touch. This continuity created strong traditions. It also limited sudden social change. Most people remained close to the class and profession into which they were born. Yet within this stability, families built meaningful lives. They celebrated births, marriages, harvests, and religious festivals together. They mourned deaths beside the same riverbanks where generations before them had also gathered in grief. The passage of time felt circular rather than sharply divided. The dead remained close through memory, ritual, and family land. Ancestors mattered deeply in Egypt. Many homes contained small spaces dedicated to family offerings. Bread or incense might be placed quietly before images of deceased relatives. People hoped the dead continued peacefully into the next world and might still offer protection or guidance to the living. This connection to the past strengthened the feeling that life should remain orderly and continuous. To break too sharply from tradition could feel disrespectful not only to society, but to generations already gone. Inside temple complexes, priests maintained sacred routines with extraordinary care. Before dawn, temple workers washed statues of the gods, replaced offerings, and burned incense within dark inner chambers lit only by torchlight. The rituals followed ancient instructions repeated precisely day after day. Clean water, fresh bread, spoken prayers, sacred oils, soft chanting echoing against cool stone walls. Many Egyptians believed these routines helped maintain balance in the universe itself. Order mattered. Predictability mattered. The rising of the sun each morning felt connected to proper ritual, proper farming, proper behavior, and proper rule. Even kings presented themselves not as destroyers of old systems but as protectors of them. Pharaohs repaired canals, maintained temples, and supervised grain storage because stability fed the kingdom. A reliable harvest meant fewer rebellions. Predictable taxes strengthened royal power. Stable villages allowed trade and labor to continue smoothly. And so the government itself encouraged continuity. Scribes copied old records carefully because ancient knowledge carried authority. Builders followed architectural traditions proven to survive. Priests preserved ceremonies passed down through centuries. The entire civilization leaned gently toward repetition. Not frozen completely. Small changes still occurred over time. Tools improved slowly. Trade introduced unfamiliar goods now and then. Different rulers influenced art or religion in subtle ways. But for ordinary workers beside the Nile, daily life remained strikingly recognizable across long stretches of history. A farmer from one century could likely understand the routines of a farmer living hundreds of years later. Both would wake before sunrise. Both would study the flood waters carefully. Both would labor beneath the same fierce sun. Both would return home exhausted beneath the evening sky. Along the riverbanks, fishermen prepared their boats during the quiet hours before dawn. Thin wooden vessels rested beside clusters of reeds where insects hovered over still water. Nets lay coiled neatly near baskets woven from river grasses. One fisherman rubbed sleep from his eyes while checking knots in the net by lantern light. His fingers moved confidently in the darkness. He knew every rope by feel alone. Nearby, his youngest son sat silently watching. The boy would eventually inherit not only the boat, but the knowledge surrounding it. Which stretches of water held the best fish during certain months? How to read changing currents. When storms might arrive from distant winds farther south along the Nile. This learning took years. And because it took years, tradition survived naturally through close daily contact between generations. Children remained deeply woven into adult life. They observed everything. Workshops, kitchens, fields, markets, and boats became classrooms without formal lessons. A child learned patience while untangling fishing line. Learned endurance while carrying water jars. Learned silence while sitting through long temple rituals beneath drifting incense smoke. Most children matured quickly because survival demanded usefulness early. Yet even amid hard work, moments of gentleness existed. At dusk, families sometimes gathered upon flat rooftops where cooler air moved through the darkness. Parents shared simple meals beside sleeping children while stars slowly brightened overhead. The desert night often felt surprisingly peaceful after the exhausting heat of day. The river carried soft sounds through the darkness. Oars dipped quietly into water. Frogs called from the reeds. Somewhere far away, musicians played faint drums and flutes during a wedding celebration drifting across the warm night air. An old man lay awake listening to these familiar sounds. Perhaps he remembered hearing nearly the same sounds decades earlier as a child beside the same river. That was part of Egypt's stillness. Life changed so slowly that memory and daily reality often blended together. The same songs survived. The same recipes survived. The same flood cycles returned. The same stars crossed the sky. And because the world around them felt enduring, many Egyptians believed their civilization itself would continue forever. During the hottest afternoons, work sometimes slowed briefly. Laborers rested beneath shaded awnings or palm trees near irrigation canals. Sandals lay abandoned beside tired feet. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Workers wiped sweat from dusty faces while flies drifted lazily around them. The heat could feel endless. Stone walls radiated warmth long after sunset. Metal tools burned hot beneath direct sunlight. Animals breathed heavily in the shade. Yet Egyptians adapted carefully to these conditions over centuries. Homes were designed to trap cooler air. Work schedules shifted around the strongest sunlight. Loose linen clothing allowed heat to escape. Daily habits evolved slowly through long experience living beside the desert. This adaptation reduced the need for dramatic change. What already worked continued working. And when a society survives successfully for centuries using familiar methods, people grow deeply attached to those methods. Tradition becomes safety. At night, torchlight flickered across temple walls covered in carved images thousands of years old even during ancient times themselves. Priests walked silently through stone halls carrying incense burners while distant chanting echoed softly through the darkness. Outside the temples, ordinary workers slept beneath flat rooftops or beside open windows seeking relief from lingering heat. A woman turned quietly in her sleep. A baby stirred briefly before settling again. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and fell silent. The Nile moved steadily onward through the darkness, as it always had. And across Egypt, generation after generation drifted through remarkably similar days beneath the same patient stars. The first light of morning often arrived quietly over Egypt. Long before the sun itself appeared above the horizon, the eastern sky slowly softened from black to deep blue. The stars faded one by one above the Nile River while cool mist hovered close to the water. Palm leaves barely moved in the still air. For a few peaceful moments, the land rested between darkness and heat. Then the sounds of waking life returned again. A wooden bucket lowered into a well. A goat pulling against its rope. The scrape of sandals across stone floors. Low voices speaking softly outside mud-brick homes. The smell of smoke drifted upward as cooking fires were lit once more. Every village along the Nile awakened in nearly the same way. And because mornings repeated so faithfully, people rarely questioned the shape of their lives. The world felt established long before they were born. Their role inside it seemed already waiting for them. In one narrow house near the edge of a farming village, a mother sat beside a small clay oven shaping rounds of bread dough with practiced hands. The room remained dim except for firelight glowing against the walls. Her youngest child still slept nearby beneath a woven blanket while older children prepared for the day ahead. The mother moved without hurry. There was no reason to rush. Tomorrow morning would likely look almost identical. And the morning after that. For many Egyptians, life was measured not by sudden changes, but by repeating seasons and familiar labor. Time felt tied to routines more than individual events. Flood season. Planting season. Harvest season. Then back again. The river decided everything. When the Nile flooded properly, the land became rich with black soil. Farmers planted wheat and barley into moist earth left behind by retreating waters. Irrigation canals carried life outward across the fields. Villages filled with cautious relief knowing there would likely be enough grain for another year. When floods were weak, anxiety spread quietly through the countryside. People watched water levels carefully because survival depended on them. Scribes recorded measurements beside temples and government storehouses. Officials traveled through farming regions inspecting crops. Farmers stared across drying fields beneath harsh sunlight and hoped the river would rise again soon. Yet even fear itself followed familiar patterns. Most Egyptians believed stability would eventually return because the Nile had repeated its cycles for longer than anyone could remember. This trust in repetition shaped the entire civilization. In the growing daylight, workers slowly filled the roads leading toward the fields. Some carried woven baskets. Others balanced wooden plows across their shoulders. Donkeys moved patiently beside them loaded with tools or jars of water. Dust rose softly beneath their feet. The road itself had likely existed for generations, pressed firm by countless footsteps over the years. Travelers knew every bend, every shaded tree, every stretch where the ground became uneven after floods. Children often walked alongside adults during these early morning journeys. They listened quietly to conversations about crops, taxes, river levels, and weather. Little by little, they absorbed the concerns of adult life long before becoming adults themselves. No sharp line separated childhood from work. Responsibility arrived gradually. A young boy might first carry only a small basket. Later he guided animals. Eventually he plowed fields beside his father beneath the full weight of the Egyptian sun. A girl might first help knead bread dough. Later she carried water jars from the river. Eventually she managed cooking fires, weaving, and household work for an entire family. Life unfolded through steady layers of repetition. The same tasks returned day after day until they became almost instinctive. In a riverside fishing village farther north, boats drifted quietly away from shore beneath the pale morning sky. The fishermen stood balanced carefully upon narrow wooden decks while lowering nets into dark water. Everything about their movements felt calm and practiced. The pull of the rope, the shifting weight of the boat, the careful reading of currents. They understood the river deeply because their lives remained close to it from birth onward. One older fisherman had spent nearly 60 years upon the Nile. His skin had darkened beneath decades of sunlight. Fine lines spread around his eyes from staring across bright water every morning. Even now, he likely worked much as his father once had. Simple tools. Simple boats. Simple routines repeated carefully across generations. Ancient Egypt changed slowly partly because many people saw little need for dramatic change. Their methods already allowed life to continue. Families survived. Crops usually grew. Villages endured. Temples remained standing. The river kept flowing northward through the desert. Continuity itself became a form of wisdom. New ideas were not always rejected completely. But older methods carried trust. A farming technique proven reliable for generations felt safer than experimentation. A temple ritual preserved from distant ancestors felt more sacred than invention. Stability mattered more than novelty. This mindset touched nearly every part of Egyptian life. In crowded workshops, artisans shaped objects using designs already familiar to customers. Pottery forms changed only gradually. Jewelry styles remained recognizable for centuries. Furniture makers built stools, beds, and chests using methods passed carefully from master to apprentice. Even beauty itself followed long traditions. Painted eyes, linen clothing, perfumed oils, braided wigs. These customs endured because they connected people to older generations and shared ideas about order and identity. Near midday, heat spread heavily across the villages. Sunlight reflected sharply from white stone walls and pale sand paths. Workers wiped sweat from their necks while continuing their labor through the exhausting afternoon. Animals rested in narrow patches of shade beside houses and market stalls. The air smelled of dust, warm mud, smoke, and grain. Inside one weaving workshop, several women worked quietly beside open windows covered with hanging cloth to soften the sunlight. Wooden looms filled much of the room. Threads stretched tightly across them while hands moved steadily back and forth through the heat. The repetitive sound of weaving blended softly with distant marketplace noises drifting in from outside. Footsteps. Donkeys. Voices bargaining quietly. Hammering from a nearby metal worker. The low hum of daily life never fully stopped. Yet nothing moved with great speed. Ancient Egyptian life often unfolded slowly because physical labor itself required patience. Without machines or modern transportation, nearly every task depended on human or animal strength. Stone had to be dragged. Grain had to be ground by hand. Water had to be carried manually. The body determined the pace of civilization. And bodies grew tired. During the hottest hours, some laborers paused briefly beneath shaded shelters near the fields. They shared water, bread, onions, or dried fish while resting aching muscles. Conversation remained gentle and practical. Discussion of crops. News from nearby villages. Concerns about taxes. Talk of marriages, births, or illnesses. Most people understood one another's lives closely because those lives followed similar patterns. Shared labor created shared understanding. At the edges of the villages, older people often rested during the strongest heat while younger workers continued the harder physical tasks. Age carried respect partly because elderly people held memories stretching back across many flood seasons. An old farmer remembered years when the Nile rose too high. Another remembered years of poor harvest. An elderly grandmother remembered which herbs eased fever during sickness. This knowledge mattered deeply because life depended on experience gathered slowly over time. Egyptian society valued continuity partly because memory itself was precious. A family survived by remembering when to plant, how to repair canals, which grain stores lasted longest, how to survive difficult seasons. This practical memory tied generations together tightly. In larger cities, scribes continued their work even through the afternoon heat. Inside government buildings and temple complexes, they sat cross-legged upon reed mats carefully recording information onto papyrus sheets. Their brushes moved patiently across smooth surfaces. Rows of symbols filled the pages. Grain tallies. Land measurements. Lists of workers. Religious texts. Tax records. Official letters. The work demanded concentration and discipline rather than physical strength. Yet scribes also lived within deeply repetitive systems. Much of their education involved copying older texts again and again until symbols became second nature. Tradition survived through careful duplication. A scribe preserved the past simply by writing it repeatedly. Many Egyptian texts themselves encouraged stability and obedience. Wisdom literature advised young people to respect elders, perform duties faithfully, and avoid reckless behavior. Good order protected society. Chaos threatened suffering. These beliefs reflected the realities of life beside the Nile. A damaged canal could destroy crops. Political disorder could interrupt food supplies. War could disrupt trade and labor. Stability was not merely comforting. It was necessary. As afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, shadows lengthened across the riverbanks. Workers finally began returning from the fields carrying tools coated with dirt and dust. Their movements appeared slower now beneath the fading sunlight. Exhaustion settled heavily across the villages. Yet evening also brought relief. The worst heat finally loosened its grip upon the land. Children ran through narrow streets while animals were fed and tied for the night. Cooking fires brightened beside doorways. The smell of baking bread and stewing lentils drifted through the air once more. Women carried fresh water into homes for the evening meal. Men washed dust from their arms and faces beside communal wells. Voices grew slightly livelier now that work was ending. Still, the overall rhythm remained calm. No loud urgency filled the streets. Tomorrow would bring the same labor again. There was little need to hurry toward it. Beside the Nile, fishermen repaired torn nets beneath fading orange skies. Birds crossed slowly overhead on their way toward marshes thick with reeds. The river reflected the colors of sunset in long shimmering bands of gold and red. An old boat rocked gently against its rope. Nearby, two children sat listening while their grandfather spoke softly about flood seasons from many years before. His voice moved slowly through the warm evening air. Perhaps the children barely understood how ancient the stories truly were. Because in Egypt, even the distant past often felt close. Massive stone temples and tombs already stood ancient during later centuries of Egyptian history. Ordinary people walked daily beside monuments built by ancestors long dead. Great statues watched silently over roads used by generations beyond counting. The physical presence of the past surrounded them constantly. This gave Egyptian life a feeling of permanence. The world seemed already old and deeply established. A farmer planting grain beneath the pyramids likely felt connected to countless earlier lives beneath the same sky. Night arrived gradually across the Nile Valley. Darkness softened the outlines of homes, trees, boats, and distant temples. Oil lamps flickered gently behind windows. The air cooled enough for people to gather outside for a little while before sleep. Some families climbed onto flat rooftops carrying woven mats. Others sat beside open doorways listening to the sounds of the village settling into silence. A musician somewhere played a soft flute. Dogs barked occasionally in the distance. Water moved quietly against the riverbanks. The stars above Egypt appeared sharp and endless in the clear desert sky. People often slept early because tomorrow's labor would begin before dawn once again. Inside one small home, a laborer stretched his tired body across a reed mat while his children already slept nearby. His hands remained sore from carrying stone all day beneath the sun. Tomorrow he would wake and do the same work again. Not because he lacked dreams or imagination, but because Egypt itself depended upon millions of repeated actions carried out faithfully across generations. The river flowed. The grain grew. The ovens baked. The boats drifted northward. The temples stood. And beneath the quiet stars, ordinary lives continued in rhythm so steady that centuries could pass with surprisingly little change at all. Deep into the night, long after most lamps had gone dark, the Nile continued moving quietly through Egypt. The river never truly rested. Moonlight shimmered across the water in soft silver patterns while reeds swayed gently along the banks. Somewhere far away, an oar dipped slowly into the current. A fisherman returning late moved carefully through the darkness, guided more by memory than sight. The desert beyond the river remained silent and immense. Cool air drifted slowly through sleeping villages where families rested close together inside mudbrick homes still holding traces of the day's heat. The smell of ash, dust, woven reeds, and baked clay lingered softly in the darkness. A baby stirred briefly. A dog shifted near a doorway. Then stillness settled once more. Only a few people remained awake during these hours. Temple guards moved silently through shadowed courtyards lit by weak torchlight. Bakers prepared dough before dawn. Some scribes continued their work late into the night beside flickering oil lamps, their tired eyes fixed upon papyrus sheets covered in careful rows of symbols. Most of Egypt, however, slept deeply from exhaustion. Life demanded constant effort from nearly everyone. Fields required labor. Homes required maintenance. Water had to be carried. Food had to be prepared. Tools needed repair. Animals needed feeding. The body rarely escaped work for long. And because life required so much physical energy simply to continue, there was little space for sudden transformation or rapid change. Survival itself encouraged routine. A man born into farming usually remained close to the fields his entire life because leaving them carried risks. Familiar work, familiar land, and familiar communities offered stability in a world where hunger could arrive quickly if systems failed. This attachment to continuity shaped even the smallest parts of daily life. The shape of bread loaves remained familiar across centuries. The layout of village homes changed only gradually. Methods of storing grain stayed remarkably consistent. Cooking fires burned in nearly identical clay ovens generation after generation. In many places, an Egyptian from centuries earlier might still recognize the daily rhythms of later villages. Before dawn, while darkness still covered the Nile Valley, the first sounds of morning slowly returned. A temple bell echoed faintly through the distance. Someone swept dust from a doorway using bundled reeds. Roosters called one after another across the village. The eastern horizon slowly brightened. Workers rose quietly from sleeping mats, rubbing tired eyes before beginning another day beneath the sun. Some ate small pieces of bread left from the night before. Others washed sleep from their faces using cool water stored in clay jars. The air still felt gentle for a little while. That brief coolness became precious in Egypt. Farmers often began walking toward the fields before sunrise because the midday heat could become almost unbearable. Their silhouettes moved slowly across dusty paths while the sky turned pale gold above the river. Nearby, women balanced jars upon their heads while walking toward wells or canals. The water inside shifted softly with each careful step. Children followed behind carrying smaller containers. Nobody needed instructions for these tasks anymore. The routines had already entered the body through years of repetition. A young girl knew exactly how to knead dough because she had watched her mother's hands since infancy. A boy understood how to tie fishing knots because he had sat beside older fishermen every evening for years. Daily life itself became a form of education. And because each generation taught the next through observation rather than radical invention, traditions survived naturally. In one farming settlement south of Memphis, a farmer paused beside an irrigation canal as dawn light spread across the land. He studied the water level carefully before stepping into the field. Tiny birds hopped through the damp soil searching for insects while mist rose gently from the riverbanks. The farmer's tools were simple. A wooden hoe. A woven basket. A curved cutting blade. Very similar tools had been used there for countless years. The simplicity of Egyptian farming often surprises modern minds, yet these methods endured because they matched the environment remarkably well. The Nile provided reliable fertility. Manual labor remained abundant. Communities already understood the rhythms of flood and harvest intimately. Large changes were not always necessary. What mattered most was reliability. And reliability became deeply respected. Even religion reinforced this feeling. Egyptian beliefs centered heavily around maintaining order against chaos. The regular rising of the sun, the dependable flooding of the Nile, and the continued balance of society all carried sacred importance. To preserve order was virtuous. To disturb it carelessly could feel dangerous. This did not mean Egyptians never experienced conflict or change. Kingdoms rose and fell. Foreign rulers sometimes entered the land. Religious practices shifted gradually over long periods. But for ordinary workers living beside the Nile, the deeper rhythms of daily life often remained strikingly stable beneath these larger political changes. A laborer still woke before dawn. A mother still baked bread over clay ovens. A fisherman still studied river currents. A scribe still copied records beneath shaded walls. The continuity of ordinary life stretched quietly beneath the movements of history itself. As the morning sun climbed higher, activity spread across the villages and towns. Marketplaces slowly filled with merchants arranging goods upon woven mats and wooden tables. Pottery jars stood in neat rows beside baskets of onions, garlic, dates, beans, and dried fish. The smells became richer as the heat increased. Fresh bread, animal dung, river mud, smoke, sweat, spices carried by traders from distant regions. Donkeys pressed through crowded paths carrying sacks of grain or bundles of reeds. Their hooves tapped slowly against packed dirt streets while flies circled lazily overhead. Voices remained calmer than one might expect. There was movement everywhere, but not frantic movement. The pace of life followed the limitations of human bodies working beneath heavy heat. People learned to conserve energy carefully. Inside one small workshop, a carpenter sat cross-legged shaping wood into a low stool using copper tools worn smooth from years of use. Fine dust gathered around his feet while sunlight filtered softly through a cloth doorway. Nearby, his apprentice watched in silence. The older man did not explain every movement aloud. Instead, the younger worker learned through observation, repetition, and gradual correction. This was how most skills survived in Egypt. Knowledge moved slowly from body to body across generations. A stonemason learned how limestone sounded beneath a hammer's strike. A brewer learned how grain smelled during fermentation. A weaver learned how tension felt within threads stretched across a loom. These lessons could not be rushed easily. They required years of familiarity. And because learning itself took time, Egyptian society naturally valued patience and continuity. At midday, sunlight blazed fiercely across the Nile Valley. The air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads while continuing through the exhausting afternoon. In the fields, farmers paused occasionally beneath narrow strips of shade cast by date palms or storage buildings. Water became precious during these hours. Laborers drank carefully from shared jars passed between tired hands. The clay containers kept the water surprisingly cool even beneath the heat. An older worker sat silently beside an irrigation ditch, soaking his feet briefly in muddy water while staring across the fields. His body carried years of labor already. Stiff joints, scarred hands, a back bent slowly forward from decades spent lifting, carrying, planting, and harvesting. Many Egyptians aged quickly beneath such conditions. Life expectancy remained uncertain, especially among the poor. Illness spread easily in crowded settlements. Injuries from labor often healed badly or not at all. Dental pain became common because stone grinding left tiny fragments of sand within bread flour. Yet even suffering itself became woven into the ordinary rhythms of life. People expected hardship. What mattered was endurance. And endurance often came from community, routine, and familiarity. In the late afternoon, children carried bundles of reeds through village streets while older women prepared evening meals beside outdoor ovens. Smoke drifted low through the warm air. Dogs searched the ground hopefully for scraps. The harshest sunlight slowly began to fade. Workers returning from the fields walked more slowly now, exhausted from the long day. Dust clung to their ankles and clothing. Some carried tools across their shoulders. Others led tired animals home beside irrigation canals glowing orange beneath the lowering sun. Conversations remained quiet. There was comfort simply in returning home safely after labor. A small meal. A cool breeze if fortunate. The company of family. These simple things mattered deeply in a world where survival required constant effort. Near the riverbanks, fishermen untangled nets while watching the evening light spread across the Nile. The water reflected deep shades of gold and red beneath drifting birds returning toward marshlands. One fisherman hummed softly to himself while repairing a torn section of rope. The melody was old. Perhaps older than he realized. Songs often survived generations because work itself encouraged repetition. Rhythmic music helped labor pass more steadily. Familiar songs accompanied rowing, harvesting, grinding grain, and hauling stone. The sound of human life blended gently into the routines of labor. As darkness slowly covered the land once more, lamps appeared behind windows across the villages. Temple fires glowed faintly in the distance. Families gathered together upon rooftops or beside open doorways where cooler night air finally arrived. Children listened sleepily while older relatives spoke about river levels, harvests, marriages, illnesses, and memories from long ago. The stars emerged one by one above Egypt. Bright, silent, unchanging. People looked upward and saw the same constellations their ancestors had watched centuries earlier. Time itself felt different beneath such skies. The past did not seem far away. It lingered constantly within buildings, rituals, songs, and daily habits. A worker falling asleep beside the Nile might feel connected to generations already gone and generations yet to come. Tomorrow would likely resemble yesterday. The river would continue flowing northward through the desert. Fields would wait beneath the sunrise. Bread would bake before dawn. Boats would drift along familiar waters. And beneath the endless stars of Egypt, ordinary lives would continue moving softly through the same ancient rhythms once again. The Nile carried many sounds through the night. Soft water brushing against reeds. Wood creaking gently from tide boats. The distant splash of an oar somewhere in the darkness. Sometimes a breeze moved slowly across the riverbanks, stirring palm leaves above sleeping villages. Other times the air remained completely still, heavy with warmth even long after sunset. Inside the homes along the Nile Valley, most people slept deeply after long days of labor. A farmer rested beside tools leaning against a mud brick wall. A child curled beneath a thin linen cloth. An old woman slept lightly near the doorway where cooler air drifted through the house. The rooms were simple and crowded. Many homes held only a few possessions. Clay jars for grain and water. Reed mats for sleeping. Wooden stools. Baskets hanging from hooks in the wall. Small oil lamps blackened by smoke. Yet these spaces carried familiarity. The same walls had sheltered families for many years. Generations often remained close together, building new rooms beside older homes as children grew into adults and started families of their own. Villages expanded slowly in this way. Not through sudden change, but through steady layers added over time. Mud bricks dried beneath the sun. Walls rose carefully by hand. Roofs were covered with reeds, branches, and packed earth. Then life continued inside them much as it always had. Before dawn, the quiet darkness slowly began to loosen once more. The eastern sky turned pale gray above the river. Roosters called from different corners of the village. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shook its harness and stamped against the ground. The first cooking fires returned. Smoke drifted upward into the cool morning air. Women sat beside grinding stones while still half asleep, pushing grain beneath the heavy stone surface in long practiced motions. The work required strength even before the day properly began. Stone against grain. Stone against grain. The sound blended with the waking village. A young boy carried kindling toward the oven while rubbing sleep from his eyes. His feet moved automatically through familiar routines. He knew exactly where the firewood was stacked. Exactly how much bread dough his family needed. Exactly how long it would take the oven to heat properly. This knowledge came not from formal teaching, but from years of repetition. In Egypt, routine became memory. And memory became stability. The world beyond the Nile Valley could feel uncertain and dangerous. Deserts stretched endlessly in every direction. Foreign lands seemed distant and unfamiliar. Sandstorms, droughts, and poor floods always remained possible. But daily routines inside the villages offered a sense of order against uncertainty. The river rose. The river fell. Fields were planted. Crops were harvested. The dead were buried. Children were born. Then the cycle returned again. For long stretches of history, this rhythm remained stronger than individual rulers or political events. Even when kings changed, ordinary life often continued almost untouched. A farmer still walked to the fields before sunrise. A fisherman still checked his nets. A baker still shaped dough in darkness before dawn. The deeper structure of life remained rooted in labor beside the Nile. As the morning brightened, workers spread outward across the land once again. Farmers crossed narrow paths between irrigation canals carrying hoes and baskets. Their feet pressed into cool soil damp from recent flooding. Birds fluttered low across the fields searching for insects disturbed by movement. The air smelled fresh for only a short while before the heat returned. One older farmer paused beside a canal to study the water carefully. He crouched low, running his fingers through the dark wet soil. Everything depended on timing. Too much water ruined crops. Too little water brought hunger. Knowledge of the land mattered more than speed. Egyptian farming rewarded patience and observation. Families remembered which fields held moisture longest. Which canals became blocked after floods. Which crops survived difficult seasons better than others. This memory passed through generations quietly. Not written in books for most people, but carried inside daily habits. A father corrected the way his son planted seeds. A mother showed her daughter how long grain should dry before storage. Small lessons repeated over years slowly shaped entire lives. In the larger towns, workshops opened early to escape the worst afternoon heat. Potters arranged newly fired jars outside their ovens while metal workers prepared charcoal fires for the day's labor. The smell of smoke and hot clay drifted through narrow streets already warming beneath the rising sun. A coppersmith hammered carefully against a bowl, the sound echoing softly between nearby walls. Clang. Pause. Clang again. The rhythm remained slow and measured. Ancient Egyptian work often demanded endurance more than urgency. There were no machines to speed labor. Human strength determined nearly every task. Workers learned to conserve energy because exhaustion arrived quickly beneath the sun. Even transportation moved slowly. Boats drifted along the Nile according to wind and current. Donkeys carried loads patiently across dusty roads. Messages between cities could take many days to arrive. This slower pace naturally reduced sudden changes in daily life. News traveled gradually. Ideas spread slowly. Traditions stayed rooted because communities remained relatively stable for long periods. In one crowded riverside market, merchants arranged goods beneath cloth awnings while flies buzzed lazily through the warm air. Baskets overflowed with onions, beans, figs, and dates. Clay jars held oil, beer, and dried fish. Woven cloth hung from wooden poles swaying gently in the breeze. Customers moved through the market unhurried. People stopped to speak with neighbors. Children wandered close behind parents. Donkeys pushed carefully through narrow spaces carrying sacks of grain. The marketplace served not only as a place for trade, but as part of the social rhythm of daily life. Familiar faces returned week after week. Merchants often remained in the same locations for years. People knew who baked the best bread, who repaired sandals properly, who sold strong fishing rope. These steady relationships reinforced the feeling of continuity within Egyptian communities. Near the edge of the market, a scribe sat beneath a shaded awning beside a low wooden table. Papyrus sheets rested neatly beside jars of ink while clients waited nearby. Many ordinary Egyptians could not read or write, so scribes performed important tasks for them: recording sales, writing contracts, preparing legal documents, keeping tax records. The scribe's movements appeared calm and careful as his reed brush moved across the papyrus. Writing itself reflected Egypt's deep respect for preservation. Records mattered because they protected continuity. Land ownership, grain storage, temple offerings, government accounts, all needed careful documentation to maintain order across generations. In the great temple cities like Thebes, scribes and priests worked within enormous stone complexes already ancient by the standards of later centuries. Temple walls rose high above the streets, covered with carvings preserved beneath the dry Egyptian climate. Inside these cool stone halls, rituals followed patterns established long before the birth of the current priests. Incense burned slowly. Chanting echoed softly through columns. Offerings of bread, flowers, and beer were placed before statues of the gods. Every movement carried tradition. Religion in Egypt was deeply connected to repetition because repetition itself symbolized cosmic order. The sun rose each day. The Nile flooded each year. The stars crossed the heavens in familiar paths. Human ritual mirrored these dependable cycles. A priest performing ceremonies inside a temple was helping maintain balance between the world of people, nature, and the divine. Outside the temples, ordinary workers continued through the heat of the afternoon. The sun climbed high above the Nile Valley until shadows nearly disappeared beneath people's feet. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Sandals scraped slowly against packed roads. Laborers carrying stone blocks paused briefly to drink water beneath strips of shade cast by nearby walls. Their shoulders ached from ropes digging into skin. Fine white dust covered their hair and clothing. Many monumental buildings in Egypt were constructed over enormous stretches of time. Workers added sections gradually across decades or even generations. Some laborers likely knew they would never see the finished structures they helped build. Still, the work continued. Not hurried. Not dramatic. Just steady. A stonecutter chipped carefully at limestone while sunlight reflected painfully bright from the quarry walls. The repetitive tapping of tools echoed through the dry air. Tiny fragments of stone collected around his feet. His father may have worked in the same quarry years before. His sons might eventually work there too. This continuity existed partly because opportunity for radical social movement remained limited. Most people inherited not only professions, but ways of life closely tied to family and local community. Yet within those boundaries, individuals still formed deep connections to their work, homes, and routines. At sunset, relief slowly spread across the land. The fierce brightness softened into warm gold. Workers returned through dusty roads carrying tools upon tired shoulders. Voices drifted gently through the villages as evening meals were prepared. Cooking fires flickered. Water jars cooled in the shade. Children laughed briefly before growing sleepy. The smell of bread once again filled the air. An old fisherman sat beside the Nile repairing nets beneath fading light while listening to the quiet movement of water against the shore. Nearby, younger fishermen prepared boats for the next morning. The old man's hands moved slowly now with age. But they still remembered every knot, every rope, every motion learned across decades upon the river. Memory lived inside the body itself. And that memory allowed Egyptian life to continue with remarkable steadiness through the centuries. Night returned gently. Stars brightened above the desert. Temple fires glowed faintly in the distance. Families gathered upon rooftops seeking cooler air before sleep. Some spoke softly together. Others simply rested in silence after the long day. A mother watched her children drifting asleep beside her beneath the warm night sky. Somewhere beyond the village, jackals cried faintly across the dark desert edge. The Nile continued flowing northward through the darkness exactly as it had for countless generations. And beneath the quiet stars of Egypt, ordinary people closed their tired eyes knowing tomorrow would arrive softly, predictably, and very much the same once again. The night over Egypt did not feel empty. It felt full in a quiet way, as if the land itself was still breathing gently after a long day of work. The Nile moved through the darkness like a slow thought, steady and unchanged. Along its banks, sleeping villages rested under the weight of warm air that never fully disappeared, even at night. Mud-brick walls held onto the heat of the day, releasing it slowly into the sleeping rooms. Inside those homes, people dreamed without urgency. A farmer's sleep carried him back to fields already familiar. A woman's rest drifted through memories of grinding grain and baking bread. A child turned softly in sleep, face relaxed, unaware of the long patterns of life already forming ahead of them. Outside, the desert beyond the river stayed silent and vast, a still presence that reminded everyone where the land ended and the harsh emptiness began. That boundary made the Nile Valley feel even more like a narrow, protected world. A world that did not need to change quickly. A world that often did not. Before dawn, the first hint of light returned again, soft and gray at first, spreading gently across the horizon. The stars began to fade without resistance, as they always did. The river caught the first reflections of morning like a mirror slowly waking. A faint breeze moved through palm leaves. Then came the sounds. A door opening. A pot being set down. A quiet cough in the dark. Life returning to motion without announcement. A man stepped outside and paused for a moment, adjusting to the coolness before the heat would arrive again. He looked toward the fields out of habit more than thought. Nothing needed to be checked urgently. Still, he looked. Because that was what people always did. Across the village, other figures began to move in similar ways, repeating gestures learned long ago. A woman tied her hair back before tending the fire. A boy gathered sticks without being asked. An old man sat near the doorway, watching the sky shift color in silence. Everything followed pattern. Everything followed memory. The Nile was already present in their minds before they even saw it, as if the river existed not just in the world but inside their expectations of each day. Soon, the fields would fill again. The same paths would be walked. The same canals checked. The same tools lifted from resting places beside doorways. And so it continued, as it had for so long that no one could easily imagine it otherwise. In the soft morning light, workers moved toward the farmland once more. Their silhouettes stretched long across the ground before shrinking as the sun rose higher. The air was still gentle, holding on to the last cool breath of night. A group of farmers crossed a narrow embankment between irrigation channels. Water flowed quietly beneath them, guided through channels carved and maintained by countless hands before theirs. The sound of water was steady, almost soothing, as if it too had learned its rhythm through repetition. One man knelt briefly at the edge of the canal, touching the water with both hands. Not for ceremony, not for prayer, but simply to feel it. To confirm it was still there. Still moving. Still reliable. Then he stood and continued walking. In another direction, a line of workers passed carrying baskets of harvested reeds. Their steps were slow but coordinated, shaped by habit rather than instruction. No one needed to lead them loudly. Everyone already understood where they were going and why. The village itself seemed to guide movement. Paths worn into the earth directed feet without effort. Doors opened and closed in familiar sequence. Even the smallest routines felt shared, as if the entire community breathed in the same rhythm. Farther along the river, a fishing boat drifted near the reeds. The fisherman sat quietly, adjusting his net with hands that had performed the same motion thousands of times. The rope felt worn but trusted, shaped by years of use. He did not rush. The river would not rush. Fish came when they came. And patience was simply part of the work. Behind him, the water reflected the pale sky, broken only by the slow movement of birds crossing low over the surface. In the fields, the heat began to grow stronger. It always arrived in the same way. Gradually, then fully, until it settled over everything. The land did not resist it. People adjusted to it as they always had. Cloth wrapped around heads. Movements slowed. Work continued, but more carefully now, as if the entire world had shifted into a lower, quieter gear. A man driving a small group of animals paused beneath the thin shade of a palm tree. The animals stood still, breathing heavily. Dust rose gently around their legs before settling again. He leaned against a wooden post for a moment, eyes half closed, listening to the distant sounds of labor scattered across the fields. Nothing urgent. Nothing new. Just the steady presence of work continuing in every direction. And that continuity gave the day its shape. In a nearby settlement, a group of scribes worked under a shaded structure near a temple courtyard. Their hands moved carefully across papyrus, recording grain counts and deliveries. The ink dried quickly in the heat. Their work was quiet, precise, and unchanging. Numbers recorded today would match the structure of numbers recorded yesterday. The same categories. The same formats. The same expectations. Even writing itself felt like repetition turned into discipline. A younger scribe paused briefly, stretching his fingers. His teacher watched without comment, then pointed once to the next line of text. No explanation was needed. The correction was understood instantly. Learning, like everything else, happened through repetition. As the day moved forward, the rhythm of labor deepened again. In workshops, clay was shaped. In fields, grain was tended. Along the river, boats carried goods between villages. In homes, bread was prepared and baked. Every action fit into a larger pattern that stretched beyond any single life. And beneath all of it, the Nile continued its slow presence, shaping not only the land but the timing of every human motion around it. By late afternoon, shadows lengthened slightly again, signaling the gradual easing of heat. Workers began thinking of return. Not with excitement, but with quiet familiarity. The end of labor always came in the same way. A final task completed. Tools gathered. Animals guided back. Paths retraced. The return home was as structured as the work itself. Villages slowly filled once more as people came back from fields and riverbanks. The sound of footsteps on packed earth mixed with low conversation. A sense of release spread gently through the air, though nothing dramatic changed. Even rest followed routine. Water collected. Food prepared. Bodies washed. Clothes loosened. Then stillness returned again, just as it always did. Near the river, a small group gathered briefly as the light softened. They did not speak loudly. There was no need. The river itself seemed to encourage quiet. One man sat with his knees drawn close, watching the current pass. He may have been thinking, or simply resting without thought. Around him, others prepared nets or repaired small tools, their hands moving slowly in the fading light. The sky turned warm with color again, as it did every evening. Gold becoming orange. Orange becoming soft red. Then slowly, that color dimmed into the deep calm of dusk. Across the Nile Valley, lamps were lit one by one inside homes and small shrines. The glow spread gently through windows and doorways, marking the return of night. Not as an interruption, but as part of the cycle. Inside a home near the riverbank, a family sat together in low light. Bread was shared. Water passed from hand to hand. A child leaned against an adult's shoulder, already half asleep. No one spoke much. The day had already said everything it needed to say through work, heat, and repetition. Outside, the night air began to cool the land again. The river reflected the first stars, faint and distant at first, then growing clearer as darkness settled. Somewhere far off, a boat moved quietly along the water, its presence marked only by the faint sound of wood and the gentle rhythm of motion. The Nile carried it forward without hurry, just as it carried everything else. And in the villages along its banks, life softened once more into sleep, ready to repeat itself again when morning returned, as it always did, without surprise, without interruption, and without end. Night settled more deeply now, not just over the land, but into the spaces between things. Between houses. Between thoughts. Between the slow breaths of sleeping people. The Nile flowed on, carrying the reflection of the sky like a long, dark ribbon of quiet light. Stars scattered above it, unchanged and patient, as if they too were part of the same repeating rhythm that shaped everything below. In the villages, the fires had grown smaller. Not gone. Just softened. A few embers still glowed in clay hearths, giving off faint warmth to homes already filled with sleeping bodies. The sounds of the day had almost fully faded. Only the occasional shift of a sleeping animal, or the distant call of something in the desert, broke the stillness. Inside one home, a young man lay awake for a little longer than the others. Not restless. Just aware. He listened to the slow breathing of his family around him. He could hear the faint movement of wind through the doorway. He could hear, beneath everything, the distant presence of the river. That sound was always there. Even when unseen. Even when ignored. It was the sound of continuation. Eventually, like everyone else, he closed his eyes. And the village returned fully to silence. Before dawn arrived again, there was a brief moment where the world felt suspended. Not night. Not morning. Just a quiet in-between. The sky above the Nile turned a faint shade of deep blue, slowly brightening as if the darkness itself was being gently lifted away. The first birds stirred near the riverbanks, testing the air before fully waking. Then, as always, life began again. A woman rose first in one house, careful not to disturb those still sleeping. She moved toward the cooking area and placed her hands on the cool clay of the oven. The motion was practiced, almost automatic. She did not need to think through it anymore. Her body already knew what to do. In another home, a man sat up and reached for his sandals. Dust clung to them from the previous day. He tapped them once against the floor before slipping them on, a small gesture that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Outside, the village began to breathe again. Doors opened. Water jars were lifted. Low voices returned. The day was coming, and it would look very much like the day before it. In the growing light, farmers once again made their way toward the fields. Their figures moved slowly along narrow paths bordered by irrigation channels and low walls of dried mud. The soil beneath their feet was familiar in a way that went beyond sight. It was known through touch, through memory, through years of walking the same ground. A group paused near a bend in the canal where water moved more quickly. One man adjusted the wooden structure guiding the flow, pressing it gently into place. No one argued. No one debated. The method had been used many times before, and so it was trusted. Trust in repetition was one of the quiet foundations of this world. Farther out, the fields stretched in soft lines of green and brown, shaped by water and time. Workers spread out across them, each taking a familiar place. Some bent low to inspect crops. Others carried tools across their shoulders. A few stood still for a moment, simply watching the land as if reading it. The land always had something to say, if one paid attention long enough. A change in moisture. A shift in soil. A pattern in how plants lean toward the sun. These small details guided decisions more than any spoken instruction. Nearby, the river continued its steady movement, unchanged by the activity along its banks. Boats had already begun to appear on the water, their sails catching the morning breeze. They moved slowly at first, then steadier as the wind settled in. A fisherman stood at the front of one boat, scanning the surface of the water with quiet attention. His hands rested on the net beside him. He had learned, over many years, that the river did not offer its gifts on demand. It followed its own timing, its own patience. So he waited. And while he waited, he observed. A ripple here. A shadow there. A sudden quiet patch where birds avoided landing. These were the small signals of life beneath the water. Behind him, another fisherman adjusted the sail. The movement was smooth and practiced, shaped by countless mornings like this one. No words were needed between them. The work itself provided structure for understanding. Across the river, on the opposite bank, small settlements were already active. Smoke rose in thin lines from cooking fires. People moved between homes and storage spaces, carrying baskets of grain or water. The scene repeated itself in variations all along the Nile Valley. It was always similar, and yet always lived anew by those within it. As the sun rose higher, the heat returned with familiar certainty. It did not arrive suddenly. It built slowly, like a presence filling the land again. Shadows shortened. Colors brightened. The air became heavier. Work adjusted without pause. Clothing was tightened or loosened. Movements became slower, more deliberate. People shifted into the rhythm they had learned since childhood: work early, endure midday, continue until evening. In a workshop near the edge of a village, a potter sat before his wheel. Clay rested beside him in damp, heavy lumps. His hands pressed into it with steady force, shaping it into familiar forms. Bowls. Jars. Simple vessels for grain, water, oil. Each movement followed a sequence he had repeated so often it no longer felt separate from thought. The clay responded to him as if it too understood the rhythm of repetition. Outside, a child watched quietly from the doorway. Not learning through instruction, but through observation. Watching how hands moved. How pressure changed shape. How stillness became form. This quiet learning happened everywhere in Egypt. In homes, in fields, in workshops, along riverbanks. Knowledge was not rushed. It was absorbed slowly, like water into soil. By midday, the land reached its brightest point. The sun hung high above the Nile Valley, pressing warmth down over everything. The air shimmered slightly above the fields. Even the river reflected light so strongly it seemed almost white in places. Work continued, but more carefully now. Under small patches of shade, laborers rested briefly. Some leaned against tools. Others sat with their backs against walls. Water was passed quietly from hand to hand. No one stayed still for long, but no one hurried either. Time in the middle of the day felt different. Slower. Heavier. Almost suspended. A group of workers near an irrigation channel took turns adjusting the water flow. One would crouch, make a small correction, then step back. Another would repeat the process. The task itself was simple, but required constant attention to small changes. Water was never entirely predictable. It moved, shifted, responded. And so people learned to watch it carefully, as if it were a living presence. In the distance, a line of donkeys carried bundles of reeds toward a storage area. Their movement was steady, unremarkable. Dust rose and fell around their feet in soft patterns that disappeared quickly behind them. A boy walked alongside them, holding a rope loosely. He did not pull or push. The animals already knew where to go. His role was simply to stay with them, to remain part of the movement. Even guidance in Egypt often felt gentle rather than forceful. As afternoon slowly eased toward evening, the light began to soften again. The harsh edges of the day slowly blurred into warmer tones. Workers began thinking of return without needing to speak about it. The idea of going home was not a sudden decision. It was a gradual awareness shared across the community. One by one, tasks were completed. Tools gathered. Animals guided back. Paths retraced. The village reassembled itself in the opposite direction of the morning. From fields back to homes. From work back to rest. From heat back to cool evening air. As people returned, the sounds of the village changed. The steady rhythm of labor gave way to softer movement. Voices became more conversational. Footsteps slowed. The air itself felt lighter, as if releasing the weight of the day. Cooking fires were lit once more. The smell of bread returned. Water was poured into jars and set aside to cool. Families gathered again in familiar spaces, sharing the quiet meal that marked the end of another ordinary day. Near the river, a fisherman pulled his boat ashore while watching the sky shift toward evening. The water reflected long streaks of orange and gold. Birds moved in loose formations overhead, returning toward the marshes where they would rest. He tied the boat carefully, as he always did, then stood for a moment before leaving. Not because anything unusual had happened, but because the day always ended in this same quiet way, and it deserved a moment of attention. Behind him, the Nile continued its steady movement, carrying light, shadow, and reflection all at once. And as night began to return again, the rhythm of Egypt prepared to repeat itself once more, gently, without urgency, and without ever truly breaking. Night arrived again without ceremony. It did not announce itself. It simply replaced the fading light until the Nile Valley became a long stretch of darkness broken only by small, warm points of glow. Oil lamps inside homes. Faint fires near doorways. Distant torches along temple walls. The rest of the land settled into quiet. The river, however, never felt fully still. Even in darkness, it kept its movement, carrying soft ripples that reflected the sky above. Stars appeared to rest upon its surface, drifting gently with every current. Along the banks, a few late travelers moved carefully between villages. Their footsteps were slow, guided by memory and familiarity. In Egypt, people often learned to recognize paths not by sight, but by how the ground felt beneath their feet. A slight dip in the soil. A familiar bend in a canal. A cluster of reeds near the edge of a path. These small details were enough. Inside the villages, families had already begun to settle into sleep. Doors were closed but rarely locked. The sense of community itself provided a feeling of safety. Homes stood close together, forming tight clusters of shared life. A child shifted in sleep, turning toward the cooler side of a mat. A man exhaled slowly after a long day of labor. An older woman adjusted a thin cloth over her shoulder without waking. The night held them all in the same steady quiet. Before dawn returned, there was again that brief, almost unnoticeable pause in time. The world felt suspended between what had passed and what was about to begin. The sky lightened. The river reflected the first hint of gray. And the village stirred once more. This repetition was not seen as strange. It was expected. Even trusted. A baker was the first to fully wake in one household. He moved toward the clay oven still warm from the previous day. The structure was simple but essential, shaped by generations of use. He checked it without urgency, knowing already what he would find. Everything was as it should be. Soon, dough was prepared again. Water mixed with grain. Hands pressed, folded, shaped. The work of bread continued as it always had, tied closely to survival itself. Nearby, farmers began their familiar walk toward the fields. Their silhouettes moved across soft morning light, long and quiet. The air carried a brief coolness that made movement easier before the heat returned. Birds followed the edges of irrigation canals, stepping carefully through damp soil. The fields were already awake in their own way. Plants stood still but alive, shaped by water, sun, and careful human attention. Every stalk of grain represented many days of repeated effort. Nothing grew quickly. Everything required patience. A man knelt near a canal and watched water flow through a narrow channel he had helped maintain since early youth. The structure was old, repaired many times, yet still reliable. He ran a hand along its edge, feeling the dampness of the clay. This was enough. Not perfection. Not change. Just continuation. Farther along the river, boats moved again. The Nile carried them northward with slow confidence. Sailors adjusted cloth sails while the wind shifted gently across the water's surface. A group of fishermen worked in silence, lowering nets into familiar sections of the river. They did not speak much. There was no need. Each movement was understood without instruction. Cast. Wait. Pull. Repeat. The river dictated timing more than human intention ever could. And people learned to follow it rather than resist it. As the sun rose higher, the village expanded into full activity once again. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Tools were lifted from storage corners. Animals were guided into position for work. The entire settlement seemed to unfold outward from its sleeping stillness. In a shaded courtyard near the edge of a settlement, a group of scribes worked with steady concentration. Their hands moved across papyrus, recording numbers and records that would help maintain order across the region. Grain collected. Labor assigned. Supplies distributed. Every entry reflected a system built on repetition and careful tracking. One scribe paused briefly, pressing the tip of his reed pen into ink again. His movements were slow, deliberate, practiced. There was no rush. There never had to be. The system worked because it moved at the same pace as the world around it. Outside the courtyard, the sounds of daily life continued. Footsteps on packed earth. Low conversation between traders. The distant call of someone guiding animals. The steady rhythm of labor blending into the background of the day. By midday, the sun once again reached its full strength. Heat settled across the land in waves. It pressed down on rooftops, fields, and open roads. Movement became more measured, more careful. Work did not stop, but it softened. People adjusted their pace without thinking about it. A farmer wiped sweat from his forehead and paused beneath the thin shade of a palm tree. The silence around him was thick, broken only by the occasional sound of wind moving through dry leaves. He watched the fields for a moment. Not searching for change. Only confirming continuation. Nearby, workers rested briefly beside irrigation channels. Water reflected the sky in trembling patterns. Someone dipped a cloth into the canal and pressed it against their neck. Another leaned back against a wall of packed earth, eyes half closed. Even rest felt structured. A pause within a pattern. In a workshop not far from the river, a potter continued shaping clay despite the heat. His movements had become slower now, but no less precise. Each vessel he formed would serve a purpose already known before it was made. Storage. Cooking. Carrying water. Simple needs. Simple forms. The apprentice beside him mirrored each motion carefully, learning through repetition rather than instruction. The older man corrected only by gesture, never by long explanation. That was enough. Across Egypt, knowledge moved like this. Quietly. Gradually. From hand to hand. From generation to generation. As afternoon began its slow descent toward evening, the village once again prepared for return. This transition never felt sudden. It unfolded naturally, as if the land itself signaled the change. Work slowed. Tools gathered. Animals turned back toward home paths. The fields emptied in stages rather than all at once. The rhythm was always the same. And that sameness created a sense of calm familiarity, even after exhausting labor. A fisherman pulled his boat toward shore while watching the sky shift in color. The river reflected the changing light in long, soft bands. Behind him, reeds swayed gently in the current. He tied the boat with practiced hands, then rested for a moment before leaving. Not because he was thinking deeply, but because the moment itself invited stillness. The day was ending again, just as it always had. And just as it always would. As evening spread across the Nile Valley, lamps were lit inside homes. Cooking fires flickered once more. The smell of bread and warm grain filled the air. Families gathered together in familiar arrangements. Sharing food. Sharing silence. Sharing the quiet end of another ordinary day. Outside, the river continued its movement beneath the first emerging stars. The desert beyond remained dark and vast, holding its stillness without change. And within this balance of river, land, and sky, Egyptian life continued its long, steady rhythm. A rhythm shaped not by sudden events, but by repetition so deep it became the very structure of time itself. And as night returned once more, everything gently settled into the same ancient quiet, ready to begin again when dawn inevitably came back over the Nile. Night in Egypt did not feel like an ending. It felt more like a pause that the land already understood how to hold. The Nile continued moving through that pause, carrying darkness and starlight together in the same slow current. Along its banks, the last small fires of the villages burned low, their glow softened by distance and sleep. Inside the homes, breathing became deeper and slower. The weight of the day released itself from tired bodies. Dust settled from clothing and hair. Hands that had spent the day working finally relaxed in stillness. There was a kind of quiet shared across the entire valley, as if thousands of lives had agreed, without words, to rest at the same time. Even the desert beyond the river seemed calmer at night. Its vast emptiness no longer felt harsh. It simply existed, dark and unmoving, framing the narrow band of life along the Nile like an endless backdrop. A few stars reflected faintly on the river's surface, shifting with the water's movement. The sky and river seemed to mirror each other, above and below, both equally steady. Then, slowly, as always, the night began to loosen. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just gently fading at its edges. A thin line of pale light appeared far in the east. The first suggestion of morning returning once more. In one village, a woman was already awake before the sky changed fully. She sat quietly beside a low fire, watching embers glow and fade. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment before she began preparing grain again. There was no surprise in her movement. No hesitation. Only continuation. Nearby, a man stepped outside and looked toward the fields out of habit. The air was still cool. The river nearby reflected a faint gray light, like the world had not yet decided to fully wake. But it would. It always did. Soon, the village began to stir again in familiar sequence. A door opened. Water was poured. A rope was adjusted on a bundle of tools. A soft voice called a name from inside a home. Life returned not as an event, but as a gradual unfolding. Across the Nile Valley, the same pattern repeated in countless small variations. Farmers rose. Bakers tended ovens. Fishermen checked nets. Scribes prepared ink and papyrus. Children followed adults without needing instruction. Everything resumed its place in the long rhythm of the land. As the sky brightened, the river became more visible again. It stretched wide and calm, reflecting the pale morning like polished stone. Boats that had rested along the banks now shifted slightly as their ropes tightened and loosened with the current. A fisherman stepped carefully into his boat. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. He paused for a moment, listening not for anything in particular, but because that was how each day began. By listening first. Then moving. He pushed off from the shore, and the river accepted him without resistance. Farther inland, farmers once again walked the narrow paths between fields. Their feet followed the same routes carved by years of movement. Some paths were barely visible anymore, but everyone still knew them. Memory had shaped the land as much as water had. A man stopped briefly at an irrigation channel, checking the flow of water with quiet attention. The system had been built and repaired many times, yet it still followed its original intention, to guide life from the river into the soil. He adjusted a small section of clay and stone, then continued on. No ceremony. No remark. Just maintenance of something already understood. In the growing light, the fields stretched outward in soft green and brown tones. Birds moved low across them, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth warming again under the sun. Work began without announcement. A group of laborers gathered to clear debris from a canal. Others prepared tools for planting or harvesting depending on the season. The exact tasks might shift, but the structure of work remained constant. Early morning labor. Midday endurance. Evening return. That rhythm shaped nearly every life along the river. In a small workshop near a cluster of homes, a potter sat beside his wheel once more. Clay was already waiting, prepared from the previous day. His hands pressed into it with the same steady pressure as always. Shape. Form. Refine. Set aside. Each vessel carried the same purpose it always had, yet each one was still made carefully, as if it mattered individually. The apprentice watched in silence again. Learning not through explanation, but through time spent observing the same actions repeated. This was how generations passed forward in Egypt. Not through sudden change, but through slow, continuous imitation. By midday, the sun rose to its familiar height, and the heat returned across the valley. The river glittered sharply under the light, and the desert beyond seemed to blur slightly at its edges. Movement across the land slowed, but never stopped. A farmer paused under a thin patch of shade, resting his hands on a wooden tool. He looked across the field, not searching for anything new, but simply taking in what was already there. Growth. Water. Light. Labor. The same elements that had always shaped this place. Nearby, workers sat along the edge of an irrigation channel, dipping cloths into cool water and pressing them against their skin. The water itself felt like the most reliable presence in the heat. Always moving. Always returning. The Nile had become more than geography. It was rhythm. It was timing. It was the structure beneath every daily action. Even time itself felt measured by it. In villages farther along the river, scribes continued their careful work under shaded structures. Ink darkened papyrus with lists that kept society organized. Names recorded. Grain counted. Work assigned. Taxes noted. These records ensured that the same systems could continue without interruption. Nothing needed to be reinvented each day. It only needed to be preserved. A young scribe carefully traced a line of symbols, then paused to compare it with an older record beside him. The similarity was expected. In fact, it was necessary. Consistency meant order. Order meant survival. Outside, the sound of daily life continued in soft layers. Footsteps. Tools striking wood. Animals shifting and breathing in the heat. Voices speaking in low, practical tones. Everything remained connected to the same underlying rhythm. As afternoon slowly softened into evening once again, the movement of the village changed direction. The fields began to empty. The paths filled with returning figures. The riverbanks saw more movement as boats came back to shore. The day, like so many before it, moved toward its quiet conclusion. A fisherman tied his boat and stood for a moment facing the water. The river reflected the warm colors of sunset, stretching them across its surface in long fading bands. He did not speak. He did not linger long. He simply finished what needed to be finished and turned away. Because tomorrow would bring the same river. The same work. The same motion. And the same quiet return. As night approached again, lamps appeared one by one across the valley. The villages softened into warm light and gentle shadow. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward into cooling air. Families gathered. Meals were shared. Silence returned in between small moments of conversation. And the Nile continued flowing, as it always had, carrying the reflection of stars that had watched over Egypt for longer than anyone could remember. Nothing needed to change quickly here. And so, for generations upon generations, it did not. The rhythm simply continued. Soft. Steady. endless. Night once again settled over the Nile Valley, not as something new, but as something familiar returning to its place. The river carried the darkness gently, the way it carried everything else. Water moved past reeds and stones with a patience that never seemed to weaken. Along its banks, the last traces of village light dimmed until only scattered points remained. A few oil lamps still burned inside homes, but even those felt quieter now, as if the flame itself had learned to rest. Inside the houses, people slept in the same positions they had fallen into many times before. On reed mats, on simple wooden frames, on packed earth softened by woven cloth. The night held them all in the same steady stillness. Outside, the desert stood silent and endless, unchanged from one night to the next. It did not press in. It simply existed, surrounding the narrow band of life along the river like a vast, patient boundary. And within that boundary, life continued its soft cycle. Far from urgency. Far from interruption. Before dawn, the first shift in darkness began again. Not a break. Just a thinning. The sky slowly lightened, as if the world was remembering itself once more. A faint breeze moved through the palms. The river reflected a pale, almost colorless sky. A bird called once, then again, before others answered across the reeds. The village stirred. Always in the same order. Always in the same calm unfolding. A hand reached for a water jar. A door opened and closed. A fire was tended without speaking. A tool was lifted from its place beside a wall. There was no need for instruction. The rhythm had already been learned long ago, carried in memory deeper than language. Across the fields, farmers appeared once more along familiar paths. The soil beneath them had been shaped by countless seasons, each layer of work building upon the last. Nothing here felt temporary. Everything felt repeated enough to become permanent. A man walked beside an irrigation channel, watching water flow through a narrow cut in the earth. The channel had been repaired many times, yet it still followed its original direction, guiding life from river to soil. He did not think about its history. He simply trusted it. Nearby, another worker adjusted a small barrier in the water's path. The movement was careful, practiced. Once it was set, he stepped back and watched for a moment to ensure the flow remained steady. Then he moved on. No ceremony. No pause for reflection. Only continuation. In the growing light, the Nile revealed itself more fully again. Boats drifted along its surface, their shapes mirrored in the calm water. Fishermen prepared nets with hands that knew every knot by memory. One man lowered his net into the river without hesitation. The motion was smooth, shaped by years of repetition. He watched the water for any sign of movement, any small disturbance that might signal life below. The river offered nothing immediately. So he waited. Waiting was part of the work. Farther inland, villages expanded into full morning activity. Smoke rose from ovens. Grain was ground between stones. Animals were led into fields. Water was carried from wells and canals. Everything moved, but nothing rushed. Time itself felt stretched and steady, like the river that defined it. In a shaded structure near a temple complex, scribes resumed their records. Ink dried quickly in the warming air as they wrote down lists that would preserve order through the season. The same structure of writing repeated across generations. The same forms. The same careful lines. One scribe paused briefly, adjusting his grip on the reed pen. His eyes scanned the previous entry, then returned to his own work. Nothing needed correction. It was already familiar, already aligned with expectation. He continued. Outside, footsteps passed along stone paths worn smooth by years of use. People moved between tasks, between buildings, between small responsibilities that together formed the shape of the day. In Egypt, life rarely depended on single moments. It depended on accumulation. 1,000 small actions repeated correctly. By midday, the sun once again reached its highest point, and the valley filled with heat. The air shimmered faintly above fields and rooftops. Shadows shortened. Movement slowed. The world seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, even while work continued. Farmers paused beneath narrow strips of shade, resting without fully stopping. Water was shared from clay jars. Breath was taken slowly. The rhythm of labor adapted rather than breaking. A man stood at the edge of a field, watching the movement of crops in the windless heat. Nothing needed immediate attention. Everything was as expected. That expectation itself became a kind of calm. Nearby, workers along an irrigation channel continued adjusting the flow of water in small, precise movements. The system required constant attention, but never urgency. Water did not hurry. So neither did they. In a workshop near the river, a potter shaped another vessel. His hands moved with quiet certainty, pressing clay into familiar forms. The heat outside made the interior of the workshop still and heavy, but the work continued unchanged. A child sat nearby again, watching the same process as before. There was no formal lesson. Only repetition. Only presence. The child would understand, in time, the shape of this work simply by seeing it often enough. That was how everything was learned. As afternoon shifted toward evening, the village once again began its slow return. Fields emptied in stages. Tools were gathered. Animals turned back toward home paths. Voices grew softer as distance closed between people and their homes. The sun lowered gradually, softening the land into warm gold. The river reflected it all. Every movement. Every return. Every quiet ending of a working day. A fisherman pulled his boat toward shore, watching the changing sky. The water carried streaks of orange and fading light. He secured the rope with practiced hands, then stood for a moment without moving. Not thinking forward. Not remembering back. Just present in the repetition of it all. Behind him, others did the same. And so the riverbank slowly filled with resting boats once again. Evening spread across the Nile Valley like a familiar blanket. Lamps appeared in windows. Cooking fires were lit. Smoke drifted upward into cooling air. Families gathered in small clusters of warmth and sound. Meals were shared without hurry. Conversation moved gently. Silence filled the spaces between words. Outside, the river darkened again under the return of night. Stars began to appear, one by one, as they always did. Their reflection trembled slightly on the moving water. The world had not changed in any dramatic way. It had simply completed another cycle. And within that cycle, lives continued as they always had, shaped by water, sun, labor, and memory so deeply repeated that it became the very foundation of time itself. As night settled fully once more, Egypt rested in its familiar quiet, waiting not for change, but for the next gentle beginning that would arrive with the dawn. The night over the Nile grew softer now, as if the world itself was lowering its voice for the last time. The lamps inside the homes burned low, their light fading into warm, quiet shadows. The river moved as it always had, but even its sound felt distant, almost like a memory of motion rather than motion itself. Reeds along the bank stood still in the dark air. The desert beyond remained vast and patient, holding everything in its silence. Inside the villages, people slept without knowing they were part of something so long and unbroken. A farmer's hands rested open beside him. A baker's body finally went still after the heat of the ovens. A child's breathing softened into deep sleep. An old man drifted into the same kind of rest he had known all his life, as if sleep itself had been passed down through generations, just like everything else. And in that quiet, the long rhythm of Egypt seemed to slow even further. Not stopping. Just easing. As if it had always been preparing for this moment of stillness. Before dawn could return again, the world remained suspended in a final stretch of night. The stars above the Nile did not change, but they felt farther away, like they were watching from a place beyond time. The river kept flowing, but without urgency. The land kept resting, but without effort. And the people, across countless villages and fields, lay within that silence together. Generation after generation had lived like this. Waking. Working. Resting. Repeating. Lives that rarely broke their pattern, because their pattern had become life itself. Not remembered as something extraordinary. Not recorded as something dramatic. But simply lived, one quiet day at a time, beside a river that never stopped moving through the desert. And now, in this final stillness, even that movement felt gentle enough to fade into sleep. The Nile continued. The desert continued. The sky continued. But for a moment, everything felt as if it had been set down softly, like a hand finally releasing something it had carried for a very long time. And in that release, there was no ending in the way stories usually end. Only the feeling of continuity easing into silence. A world that had repeated itself so many times it no longer needed to announce another beginning. Just rest. Just stillness. Just the quiet presence of everything that had always been there. And slowly, like a final breath settling into the night, the history of ordinary lives beside the Nile drifted into calm, endless quiet.